Dusty from Discovery Lab in Tulsa, Oklahoma for Discover at Home, a series of activities and experiments which you can do with a parent or caregiver at home. Our activity this time is our May Day Challenge, where we'll be learning about astronomy and constellations. Some of you may be wondering, what's a constellation? A constellation is a grouping of stars which is recognizable and has been named, generally after a mythological figure. These stars are giant balls of gas burning like a giant nuclear reactor, giving off heat and light. Their light depends upon their distance from the Earth as well as their age. Our closest star is our Sun, also called Sol. That's why we call all the planets that orbit around the Sun the solar system. Why are constellations important? Well, constellations have been utilized by cultures for ages. One such way was navigation. Whenever ancient sailors were trying to find their way across the oceans, they could look into the night sky and know specifically where they were based upon which constellations they could see at night. By making our stars into constellations, it made it easier to recognize groupings of them. Another way that we used constellations was before the advent of calendars. Knowing which constellations would be visible in the night sky made it easier to know which time of the year it was. So what does this all have to do with May Day? Well, May Day is an ancient celebration practiced by the Celtic people. This was a point at a cross quarter, halfway between an equinox and a solstice. In an equinox, the days and nights are roughly equal. We have what we call the spring equinox and the fall equinox, where we have approximately the same amount of light and dark in a day. In our solstice, that's a point where we have either the most light in a day or the least. In our summer solstice, we're the closest to the sun, so days are warmer and longer. In our winter solstice, we're the furthest away from the sun, so days are shorter and colder. May Day was celebrated because the Celts knew that that was a time at which their plants would begin to start sprouting. This was a celebration of spring and renewal. So, we've actually got 2 projects for you with this challenge. The first of which is we're going to make ourselves a handheld constellation. Some of you guys might already be familiar with some names of constellations and not know it. If you've ever heard of any zodiac symbols like Cancer, believe it or not, those are actually named after constellations we can see in the sky during those times of the year. You may have also heard of the Little Dipper and the Big Dipper, but did you know those are actually smaller parts of a bigger constellation? For instance, the Big Dipper is part of Ursa Major, or the Bear. The Little Dipper is a part of Ursa Minor, or the Little Bear. So, let's get started on our first activity. Let's go over our materials for this activity. First thing you're going to need is some cardstock or cardboard. You can use a recyclable if you'd like, but make certain it has a pretty good flat surface. The next thing you're going to need is some scissors. You're also going to need a small push pin, thumbtack, needle, something to make really tiny holes with. You're also going to want a pencil to help us draw, a flashlight of any size. Make sure you get the brightest one you can or change the battery so that it's brighter, some tape, and a paper tube. The first thing we need to do is we need to make some paper circles out of our cardstock. Now, my flashlight is a little bit small, so I'm going to be utilizing this paper towel tube right here. If you have a bigger or wider flashlight, you don't have to use this paper towel tube. What you can do is just set your flashlight down and trace around it. Because mine's a little bit smaller, I'm going to be using my paper towel tube to make it a little bit bigger. So, set your paper towel tube or your flashlight down on your cardstock. Take your pencil and draw a couple of circles, depending upon how many constellations you want to do. I think I'll do 3. Try and get it as close to perfect as possible. If it's a little bit bigger, that's better than small. Because if it's bigger, it makes it harder for light to leak out. However, if it's smaller, we might have some light leaking out in spots that we don't want to happen. So, that would mess up our constellation viewer. Alright, I've got my circles traced. Now I need to cut them out. Once again, try and cut them out a little bit bigger. It's easier to trim off a little extra than it is to add more cardstock. Now the reason I'm using cardstock again is because I don't want any light to leak through. If I use regular paper, it might be too thin, and more light than I wanted to would leak out, and it wouldn't make my constellation look as good. So any good thick paper that's going to block a lot of light is going to be perfect. If you don't have any cardstock, you might be able to get away with using thicker cardboard. It's going to be a bit harder to cut through. All right, and that is going to be my last circle. And I'm going to double check and make certain they are the right size for my paper towel tube. And yep, they fit right over there. Once again, it's okay if there's a little overlap. Bigger is better than smaller. If I have a little bit too much of a gap, you can see my light would get in and it would really mess up my constellation. All right, so I've got 3 circles cut out. Now I need to draw some constellations, like we talked about earlier. If you don't know any constellations off the top of your head or don't have a picture of them right in front of you, like I do, you can do a real quick search using the internet or any other reference material to get a good picture of the stars in the constellation. I think I'm going to do the Big Dipper and Cancer. So I can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stars in this one. So I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to try and put 5 dots in the exact same order as these stars are. So let's see now. Make sure the spacing is the same too. You don't want one that's really far apart to be close together. One that's really close together to be far apart. Kind of messes with the design of it. There's my Cancer right there. Now, remember how I said Ursa Major actually contains the Big Dipper in it? I'm just going to use the stars to make it the Big Dipper rather than the entire constellation. So let's see, this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 dots for this one. And once again, I'm going to try and make certain that I get the placing and the angles between them as close as possible to real life. All right, that's going to do it for my Big Dipper too. Now it's time to attach them to our tubes. So I need to tape this guy down and make sure it's solidly down and no light gets in the outside. So I'm going to set it down. I'm going to grab my tape and I'm going to tape down every edge nice and securely. If you leave a gap, remember, that's going to give a spot for light to get through. It's going to mess up our constellation. We want a good, dark, solid tube that's not going to let any more light through than necessary. All right, that guy right there. And I think, just to make sure it is on really well, I'm going to go all the way around it once. Okay. Double check and make sure you don't have any gaps. I can see that I have one little gap right here on this side that might cause me some trouble. But other than that, I think I've got that pretty well. So, I've got my constellation attached to the end of my tube. Now I need to take my push pin and poke holes where I made those dots. So, make little dots to start off with, because again, you can always make bigger dots. If you make them too big, it's harder to make littler dots. All right, so now I've pierced my cardboard so that way I have got my holes in the exact order of my constellation. Now, before we test it with a flashlight, here's a quick look of what it looks like up close. You can see I have got my patterns of Cancer pierced in right there. They're very small holes. That's okay. We only really need a little pinprick of light to go through. All right, so we have turned our lights off so it's nice and dark so we can see our constellation. I'm shining my flashlight through my tube up against a nice, dark, flat surface. You might have to move the flashlight a little bit to make sure the beam goes straight through the tube, but we can see all of our stars of our constellation. If you want to make one brighter than the others, you could make the hole a little bit bigger. Remember, some stars are more luminous or more bright than others because of their age or their distance from the Earth. It's time for our second activity. This is our Constellation Identification Challenge. We're going to create a way to identify constellations that we see in our own sky. To do this, you'll need a few things. The first thing you'll need is something to create your viewer with. You could use something like an old box, some big tubes, popsicle sticks, Then you're going to need a clear screen to see through. You could use something like plastic wrap, packing tape, contact paper, or any other clear plastic that you can cut and tape to your viewer. Speaking of that, you're going to want some scissors to make sure you're able to cut and trim things. Then you want a way of marking the constellations or stars you see. I'm going to use a Sharpie, but you could just as easily use a wet or dry erase marker. Let's do it. I'm going to show you a couple different versions. It's okay if yours doesn't look like mine. You can make what you have at home. Now, I'm going to start off with this cardboard box right here. I'm going to cut myself a good chunk, so that way my viewer can be handheld and I can move it all around. One of the reasons why it's important to know what constellations are in the sky is because it lets us know what time of year it is. Because the Earth is constantly rotating on its axis, turning around and revolving, going all the way around the sun, the constellations in the sky change depending upon the time of the year. That's how the people were able to know which time of year it was based upon the constellations they could see in the sky. Our viewers can help us spot some of the constellations that we talked about in our first part of our activity. Now I've got a good chunk of cardboard right here. I need to cut out a viewing window or screen. I'm going to cut a big hole in the middle. Remember, when you're using scissors, keep your fingers out of the way. You don't want to end up covered in Band-Aids. That's no fun. Try and keep your cardboard rigid. In other words, don't cut it so thin that it gets floppy, otherwise it's harder to hold. Now, if you have an X-Acto knife, you can use that. Just make certain you have an adult to help you, because they can be dangerous. All right, almost got it. I think a little bit more. All right. A little tail right here I can cut off and get it a little bit more squared up. There we go. Can't get that guy. All right. I've cut out a framed cardboard that I can use to make my viewer. I'm going to grab some plastic wrap. I'm just going to lay the plastic wrap over the top of my viewer. If you've got contact paper or anything else that's thin and plastic, you could use that here too. Get enough that it covers the entire viewer. Cut a sheet off, or rip it, whatever's easier for you. And then we're going to tape it down firmly. You don't want it to be too loose. I'm going to actually flip this guy over and tape it on the back to make sure he gets on there nice and tight. Get yourself a couple pieces of tape and start taping. Remember, we want this to be nice and snug. You don't want it to be too loose. So really pull it. That's the fun thing about plastic wrap, is it stretches pretty easily. Get it that way. Pull tight this way. That's also why you want to make certain that your cardboard is nice and stiff. If it's too bendy, it won't be able to hold up against the plastic. All right, so there we go. I've got that pulled pretty tight. I can also pull some on these corners to make it look a little bit neater. But I think you guys get the idea. Let me show you one other way. If you've got an old cardboard tube like this, all you need is some packing tape or contact paper to make your constellation viewer. Get yourself a big piece of packing tape or contact paper, cover the entire mouth of your tube, and then fold it down. I'm going to make a few little cuts on the corners so that way that I can fold it a little bit more smoothly so I can get that wrinkle. All right, fold him down, wrap it around like so. All right, and there we go. Now I have a viewing window on the end of my paper tube. So the way to use these viewers, no matter what shape or size yours is in, is you will hold it up to the night sky and see if you can recognize any of the constellations we discussed earlier, or ones that you found out about on your own. Take your marker, and while holding your hand as still as possible, dot where you see those stars. So that way you can trace the position of those stars that we talked about with our constellations. What ones do you think you can find this time of year? So that's going to do it for our two activities, our flashlight constellation, as well as our nighttime constellation viewer. Some of the things we learned in this challenge were about constellations, equinox, and solstice. We also learned why those were significant to ancient cultures. We also learned a little bit about why it's important for us today. Our challenge to you is send us some of the constellations that you found with your constellation viewer. I've been Mr. Dusty, and thanks for hanging out with us at Discovery Lab.